Title of the talk today is Facing the Past, Penn's Ties to Slavery. Kathleen Brown is the David Boyce Professor of History at the University of Pennsylvania and the Director of the Alice Paul Center for Research on Gender, Sexuality, and Women. Van Jessica Gladney is a 2018 graduate of the University of Pennsylvania and a Public History Fellow for the Penn and Slavery Project. Together they will discuss the impetus behind the creation of the Penn and Slavery Student Research Project in fall of 2017 and some of its findings. Please welcome our speakers today.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for inviting us. We're really honored and humbled to be in your midst. I'm Kathleen Brown. This is Van Jessica Gladney. The way we usually organize our talk together is that I give that 5 to 10 minute introduction. I turn it over to Van Jessica, who will actually present you some of the findings, because this is a student-led and student-driven research project. And then in the last 5 to 10 minutes, we'll talk together about where the project is at the moment, some of the interesting challenges that we've faced, and sort of where we are hoping to go from here. So just giving you a kind of quick background on how we got started in this. As many of you know, there are many colleges and universities that began to look into their historic ties to slavery and the slave trade. Among them, pretty notably, Georgetown University as a Jesuit institution. Maryland Jesuits actually ran plantations, and the institution itself owned enslaved people. And in the course of studying their institution, they discovered that the institution had made a decision to sell enslaved people who had been owned by the university to plantations in the Deep South. And there's an ongoing effort to work on reparations for the descendants of those people and for the university to come to grips with its legacy. Brown University, a very different kind of history. The founders of Brown University, a lot of the capital that they amassed to found the university came directly from their role in the slave trade. And this is something that was always known about that family, but it's emerging even more in the historical scholarship, that New Englanders, as merchants, had a much more prominent role in not just the slave trade, but also in doing business with West Indian partners who were actively involved in slavery. And so New England, although we tend to look back at it and think of it as this regional center of abolition, actually had a very complicit history, and Brown University was one of those places. Since then, Princeton and Harvard have also gotten involved in projects examining their own histories, as have a number of universities around the country. And in fact, in the first year of the project, we had an opportunity to send Van Jessica and a couple other students affiliated with the project. Actually, one was a graduate student, to attend a gathering of students who and administrators who were involved in these projects nationwide. So Penn was hardly leading the charge on this. And one of the reasons it wasn't leading the charge was the mistaken story coming out of university archives, but I would also say the administration, which was a story that was very comforting to people in the Penn community to believe about themselves, which was that Penn, uniquely among the Ivy League institutions, had nothing to do with slavery. Yes, and in fact, everybody who had any historical knowledge of the period knew that couldn't be true, but nobody was really stepping up. And it was a story that served certain purposes. There were lots of reasons why people wanted to believe that story and continue to tell that story about institutional history. So very long time, 22 years. And when the headlines were appearing in 2006 about, all clear, Penn has nothing to do with slavery, I was a pretty distracted and overwhelmed mother of 3 children, basically trying to keep my head up and get into class and do my job and hang on. So I, at that point, did not get involved in Penn's public discussions about this. And when I sort of came back into my own skin as a teacher and researcher and writer, I got involved in teaching a course in the history department that was a reinvention of the introductory history class. And luckily, for me, in one of the iterations of that course, in 2017, spring 2017, we had some really amazing undergraduates. One of them is standing right next to me right now. And so I knew about some of these other projects. I had actually talked to some colleagues in the history department, but I'm also an affiliate of Africana Studies at Penn. I talked to some colleagues in Africana Studies, and I said, don't want to step on any toes, but has anybody really looked into this? And everybody said, well, I don't think there's anything really to look into. So these were actually very well-informed, historians. One of the historians at Penn who since left had actually countered the University Archive's official story that Penn had nothing to do with slavery, and said, of course it did. There's no place that didn't have something to do with slavery, which is really the truth. So I said to this group of really young, vital, curious undergraduates in this newly revamped history class, if there's anybody who's interested in looking into this, come see me after class. And 5 of them, who happened to be, I think maybe 3 or 4 of you came from that class. A couple others came from elsewhere. But the 3 who came from that class were really among the most amazing students in the class. So we started kind of quietly as an independent study with 5 people. And we immediately could see we were running into some flack because we had to work with the university archives, but the university archives felt protective over the story that Penn had nothing to do with slavery. So it was a little bit difficult to work that out. We did a public presentation. I got a call from the president of the university. I got calls from the provost of the university. And there was a little bit of, a few tense moments, I would say. And we dug in, we did a very successful presentation. I'll let Jessica share the results for you. But it became clear there really was something there to be investigated. We started looking at trustees, and we had findings about that in that fall semester 2017. In spring 2018, we had more students join us. We began looking very much at the medical school, and I'll tell you a little bit more because that's really where a lot of the research is right now, a full year later. So let's see what else I wanted to tell you here. It's a student-led project, and so that means all the initial research was done by students, not by me. They are not doing my research. Right? They're not my little research assistants. They're not my minions. They're in charge of this project, and part of what I wanted to teach them was about ethical production of knowledge and ethical claims about knowledge. So very differently from a lot of the teaching and educating that goes on, even at a place as prestigious as Penn, they were not there to satisfy me, professor, is this going to be good enough to get me an A? They had to really be thinking about what the work they did was going to do to the larger public conversation, what the consequences were going to be. And they had to really learn how to know when they knew something. Okay, and that's very different from handing in a history paper to your professor at the end of the semester. And it also means a certain amount of discipline as a group. When the student newspaper wants a juicy quote about what's actually going on, and you don't know for sure what you found, you actually have to figure out a way to both be responsive but also be responsible, right? And ethical about when it's okay to say what you know, when you really know it. So I think in part because my role was as a kind of a guide and a mentor and somebody occasionally steering and helping to define, okay, let's look at this or let's look at that, but not doing the research. It really fed the student interest in this project. They really had a sense that they owned it. And they still own it, although some of the work overlaps a little bit more with my own research, and I've been able to be a little bit more helpful to them as we've gotten into looking into the medical school and its role in credentialing generations of Southern doctors who then went back to the South, practicing what we know as plantation medicine, which basically means taking overworked, undernourished, badly treated people and keeping them alive so that they can work more. So that's where we are now. I'm going to turn it over to Fred and Jessica to talk about the actual stuff we found, and then we'll both talk a little bit about what it's been like to work in this project in our different capacities.
Thank you, Professor Brown. Hello, how's everybody doing? Thank you so much for having us today. I'm really excited to share information about the project, and I actually just want to mention what you said earlier about Penn's expansion into the West Philadelphia community. I think that it's really interesting as someone who went to Penn and now works with this project to watch the study of the past of our university and now the way that our university is interacting with the community of Philadelphia. So thank you for that information. Sorry, just thank you. But now to the project. So, as Professor Brown said, we started the project because a few years ago Penn explained that we had nothing to do with the slave trade. We cited our involvement with the Quakers back in the day, which if you do research into the Quakers, there's not a lot of ground there to deny slavery. And we said we had no direct involvement and none of our 18th century trustees benefited from slavery. So, at Professor Brown's suggestion, we took a look at the trustees. But before doing that, we started looking up what the definition of complicity is. I think sometimes we're really quick to say, oh, I didn't own slaves, or no one near me owned slaves, so I'm not involved in the slave trade. And one of the things about studying slavery is you have to study around ownership as well, because it wasn't just people who owned slaves, it was people who purchased products made from slave labor and different industries that work together to either support or be supported by the slave trade. So we decided to look at complicity in a more holistic sense. But first we did take a look at ownership. There are 126 trustees in the 18th century time span of the University of Pennsylvania. Out of those 126, we have found 77 to have owned slaves. We know our first provost owned a slave while he was our first provost. We know our first English professor, Ebenezer Kinnersley, owned a slave, and that slave worked on campus. So we did this by looking at a lot of the tax records. I didn't know that, I knew slaves were property, but what I did not know was that back in the day when we filed taxes, we had to actually write down how many slaves we had. So it became very clear, very quickly, who owned slaves. This is our first provost, and during the year 1769, he owned one slave. But now going into slavery, we know more about the slave himself and not just the owner, Ebenezer Kinnersley. He was our first English professor. He received payments for his slaves' work. His name was Caesar, and we found that out using the date book that the trustees would write things down in. They went to. Caesar was tasked with ringing the bell and making fires, and Ebenezer Kinnersley was paid for all of the work that Caesar did. Caesar and Ebenezer actually went on a trip down to the Barbados, and that's when we learned a lot more about Caesar through Kinnersley's journals, writing about how he's sick and he needs to come back. And it's really fascinating how much information there was about Ebenezer Kinnersley all throughout our books, but there was only a couple sentences about Caesar. We had to take a bunch of information and piece it together. But we decided to look past just people owning things and the way that slavery was present on our past and current campus. We are now located in West Philadelphia, but back in the day, we were on 4th and Arch. If you go to 4th and Arch, there's a plaque of Benjamin Franklin, and it's like, oh, University of Pennsylvania, founded in 1740. The original building, which is no longer there, was intended as a church, and it was renovated by this man, Robert Smith. Now, if you have been to Old City at all, you've seen tons of Robert Smith's buildings. He helped design Ben Franklin's house, Christ Church. The steeple in Christ Church was actually the tallest point in all of the colonies for about 50 years. And he also helped build Carpenter's Hall. So he was a well-accomplished carpenter, and he worked for the Carpenter's Company. The Carpenter's Company, based right here in Philadelphia, permitted the architects and construction crew to use slave labor and pay for the allowances to use slave labor on different projects. And we know that Robert Smith owned two slaves and one slave in 1769 and 1774, respectively. Now, to be clear, we have not found an explicit document that says we hired or we bought this slave for the purpose of working on our university. We have not found explicit proof that a slave labor was used to build the campus, but in the project, we've all kind of developed a mantra of absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. So we're still looking. The one thing we kept looking at was, okay, so if Robert Smith renovated the building, what was it doing there in the first place? Well, that led us to information and exploration into George Whitfield. George Whitfield, this was my personal part of the project, so I'm really excited. Well, excited to read it. But George Whitfield was the founder of Methodism, and he was a really powerful preacher. And one of the things he was known for was being one of the first preachers to preach to audiences of white people, freed black people, and slaves all at the same time. And that was something that a lot of people didn't do. He actually wrote a huge article to different slave owners in different colonies and criticized them for being cruel to their slaves. Now, one of the things he really focused on was the failure to convert his slaves their slaves to Christianity, but he never actually condemned the institution. So he went on a couple of journeys from Philadelphia to South Carolina and Georgia, and in 1735, the colony of Georgia had overturned slavery. They outlawed slavery because they were afraid that different slaves were going to revolt and, kill all their slave owners. So in 1739, Whitfield's followers started building him a preaching house on 4th and Arch. So that is where the plaque of Benjamin Franklin is. He wrote a letter saying that slavery is bad if you don't convert your slave to Christianity, and then he established an orphanage in Georgia. A few years later, he writes a letter saying that he realizes now, based on a business venture he had in South Carolina, how financially beneficial it is to have slaves, because when you have people working for you, you don't have to pay them, you keep more money. So he decided to ask people in Georgia, the different legislators in Georgia, to overturn the laws and reinstitute the institution of slavery in Georgia. And he was successful. He threatened to pull his orphanage out of Georgia, thus removing a lot of jobs and opportunities for different people in Georgia. Before the laws were actually overturned, he smuggled slaves into Georgia, and different journals of different students who attended the school, say, oh, I saw a slave. Oh, slaves. And then in 1749, the Whitfield Meeting House was chosen as the site of the Academy of Philadelphia, now known as the University of Pennsylvania. He successfully re-legalized slavery and then died with 50 slaves to his name and bequeathed them to someone else. So there's an interesting connection to Penn and George Whitfield. Because George Whitfield was the owner of our original building, we decided to change our founding date. First, it was 1775. The original date you can see on the original seal was 1750. And then we moved it back to 1749. We celebrated our centennial in 1849. But then we realized that Princeton was founded in 1746. So we wanted to be older than them, and thus claim ourselves the first university. So we said, oh yeah, George Whitfield started building that building in 1740, and even though we didn't start teaching there until 15 years later, we're just going to, say George Whitfield was part of our university. In 1919, we built this statue and put it on our campus. And on our campus, he's sitting actually in the interior quad of freshman dorms, and there's named after 15 fancy, famous people from back in the day. And 15 out of those are named after slave owners. So a lot of freshmen come to Penn, and they live in dorms like these, and live in the shadow of that man. And one of the frustrating things is that when we talk about this question of doing something that's right, or doing something for the right reasons, the only reason we claim that man as part of our legacy is because we want to claim the title of being the first, being the oldest university. And in doing so, and making these claims of being the slavery, and then including men like George Whitefield in our legacy, we're telling our history in a way that longevity is more important than truth, and reputation is more important than rhetoric. And that's one thing I'm really proud about this project, because we are giving a more honest picture of the university that I, even through all this, was very proud to attend. So, and there was more. So the University of Pennsylvania right now is a pretty wealthy university, but back in the day, we were having some financial struggles in the beginning. So we decided to send a fundraising trip down to South Carolina. That is William Smith, our first provost, aforementioned slave owner, and he was sent to South Carolina to collect donations from about 98 people, and went out of his way to deliberately pursue prominent slaveholding families. Some of the slaveholding families were members of the Continental Congress, which I'll talk about a little later, some of the largest slave traders in the state, people who owned hundreds of slaves, and sought donations from those men and those families to make sure that Penn had enough wealth to continue existing. We also did this again. We sent John Morgan, founder of the medical school, to Jamaica. And we received donations. This is a list of most of the donors that donated from Jamaica, all of them slaveholding families, or most of them slaveholding families. Because Jamaica and South Carolina had a very different type of slavery than Philadelphia. It was more of a representation of chattel slavery, where in Philadelphia we like to say that ours was more domestic slavery. Then, as Professor Brown said, we shifted into studying the medical school. Now, we've done a lot more research since then. This is still our early findings. We still need to do some fact-checking of the checking that we have facted. But one of the things that we noticed about the medical school is there were tons of advertisements coming from the University of Pennsylvania all over the country. We advertised heavily in the South, and graduates and faculties wrote extensively on the racial pseudoscience during the 19th century. So this is where, these states are where the ads, or I guess, states at that point, yeah. These states are where a lot of the ads were sent in newspapers across the South. And when someone would respond to the ad and come to the University of Pennsylvania to hear a lecture, they would hear people like Samuel George Morton speak. And what Samuel George Morton would do is he would talk about his 5 distinctions of races and how they were categorized into different racial hierarchies. Now, I feel like this image, or an image like this, we've all seen one of these before, based on the concept of phrenology, ranking people of intelligence, or whether they deserve certain rights, or submission or dominance based on physical features of race and jaw size. And that was a professor and a lecturer at Penn. Josiah Knott was a man who studied under that man, and he wrote Knott's Types of Mankind. Similar images with describing different skull shapes and skull sizes and comparing them by race. We were able to trace the way that rhetoric didn't just stay in a bubble. And much like the beginning, where a university says something, it makes a statement, puts a stamp on it, kind of certifies it, Like a lot of professors at Penn say, there's nothing to research about slavery because the university said so. Much like, this is true because the university said so. And I think there's actually, that's a strong responsibility when you have to think about that. As an academic institution saying things, they add a certain weight in certification. And that's why when I think about Penn's history, and I think about Philadelphia's history, I also think about American history. I mean, are all of you born and raised in Philly? No? Oh, cool. So, how often do you tell people that this is America's birthplace? I tell people all the time. Yeah. Because this is where the Declaration of Independence was signed, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. And a lot of the people who were signing those documents were helped founding our school. George Whitefield, he or George Whitefield, he was here really early. Hugh Williamson, he helped craft the 3/5 compromise at the Constitutional Convention, the one that says that all slaves are worth 3/5 of a person. Ebenezer Hendersley was helping Ben Franklin, with electricity, the kite and stuff. Henry Middleton, which we talked about, or who we talked about earlier, was a member of the Constitutional Convention. Several of our trustees were members of the Signers Club, or men who signed the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. So I sometimes think, when we think about these ideas of these smart men getting together in Old City, talking about independence and freedom, they were denying that independence and freedom from several people. And then you can trace Penn's involvement in slavery through one of the most famous slave narratives in America, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl by Harriet Ann Jacobs. She talks about her very abusive slave owner and names him Dr. Flint. She uses a lot of pseudonyms in the text. But his real name is Dr. James Norwood, and he was a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania. Now, then moving back to the rhetoric, it didn't just stay in storybooks. This was Alexander Stevens' cornerstone speech, where he talked about slavery subordination to superior races as natural and normal condition based upon the great physical, philosophical, and moral truth. Alexander Stevens was the vice president of the Confederacy. So this language that was established and certified at Penn was used to later justify fighting the Civil War to continue and protect the institution of slavery in the nation. And one thing that's really you have to look behind you before you really know where you're going. And when you study politics or current events, you really have to look to see where things are in history. And one of the great things about the Penn and Slavery Project, or the complicated things, is we start peeling back layers of what we see going on in our country today and what we see going on in our country 50 years ago. We keep pulling back layers, and it's all just stacked on top of each other. And that's one of the most rewarding parts of this project, and the most rewarding parts of sharing information about this project, because it adds a little bit of historical context to the way people might understand America, or Philadelphia, or the University of Pennsylvania. And if Professor Brown wants to come up, we can move on to the next part of the talk. Otherwise, I'm just going to keep on the segue.
So the only thing I'll add is you can see why when Van Jessica graduated and the provost, who has become a great supporter of this project, we helped convince him that we needed some resources and we needed real support, not just toleration of our existence, but we actually needed money, research money for the students, and we got half of a postdoctoral fellow. But he got to know Van Jessica, and he agreed that she could be our public history fellow. And so when you invited me, or Betsy invited me to come here, how inappropriate it would be for me to present the research in this project, because this really does come out of student research. And I'm very proud to say that not only is Van Jessica everything you can see here talking about the project, she's actually applied to history PhD programs and is waiting to hear word on where she's gotten in. She's going to do great things. So I guess I would just follow up on what Van Jessica said with two points. It was shocking in that first semester of research with the trustees how easy it was to disprove the university's claim. Low-hanging fruit. They said no trustees, no involvement in slavery. And I said to them, let's just look at the 28 trustees that I think are the most likely suspects, and 20 of those 28 owned slaves. It was easy. It was as easy as falling off a log. And I can say that I didn't do the work. But it was like, it doesn't normally happen that easily with historical research on the 18th century, that you just say, oh, I'm going to look at this, and there it is. So that was a bit shocking. We're a little shocked at present with some of what's going on in the research on the medical school. Let's see, just quickly, explain this part of it, and then I know we're near the end of our time. There was a long serving medical dean, Dean William Horner, who served for 30 years as medical school dean, from Virginia originally, maintained strong ties to Virginia. While he was the medical school dean, he, like Professor Samuel Morton, collected specimens from patients who didn't make it and from people he had contacts with. We know he had some contacts in Virginia and other places who sent him the bodies of dead people, including enslaved people. He amassed a huge collection of specimens, and nobody could really figure out where they ended up. And we kept asking. We asked Modern Museum, College of Physicians. We heard that they were over at Temple University. Somebody said to us they were still at the Wistar Institute. We haven't gotten full answers on all of this, but what we do know is that that a lot of these ended up back at the Penn Museum, and that this was one of the reasons why Penn was such the kind of gold standard of medical school teaching. It's sort of the equivalent in the present day, or not really the present day because everything's digital, the equivalent in the 1960s of having a great student library. Or gymnasium?
Yeah, sports.
Okay, all right. But so in other words, so much of medical school training was about dissection, but also actually having prepared specimens. They were prepared, they were preserved in a number of different ways, and he had an enormous collection. All professors of medicine did. But when he died in 1852, he bequeathed the collection to what was then the Wistar Museum, and requested that it be called the Horner Wistar Museum. And his specimens were worth $53,000 in 1852 dollars. That's like a huge amount of money. So we know that, if we want to do it very broad brush, that there is a history of institutions of higher education, and this is Penn's particular role in the story of higher education and slavery, enabling some populations of students to gain credentials and develop intellectually and produce knowledge through the exploitation of the bodies of other populations of people. And so, we can see variations on that in the present day, in the announcement about what's going on in West Philadelphia, which has been going on for a really long time. You can see it in controversies around what Penn has done with certain pieces of land that were African American graveyards. There's all kinds of ways that the well-being and the integrity and the right of people to protect the bodies of their loved ones really varies by race and class in the history of the United States. And some of what we see is the institutionalization of that through medical training, and in this case at Penn, it's training of lots and lots of Southern white men. Okay, Penn's medical class, which was the biggest degree that they gave out in the 19th century. There weren't very many students at the college compared to the medical school, and 30% of those students were from Virginia, and a majority came from the South. Okay, so it was a really big deal in credentialing doctors in the U.S. South. Okay, so when Jessica talks about that kind of integration into all of American history, this is not local history. Right? This is not a kind of small footnote in the history of higher education. This is really about a whole system of thinking about and producing knowledge around racial inferiority that supports a system of exploiting labor. Mm-hmm. Yeah, please.
And one of the most interesting parts of this is the institutions that both benefited from enslaved labor or bodies of enslaved people or training people to work on enslaved people, and then help perpetuate this narrative to justify that institution. Also, and this is not just Penn, but also barred descendants of those enslaved people from attending those universities. It's like the universities were built on the the benefits of slavery and the institution and the labor and the bodies of enslaved people, and then their descendants were barred from accessing those benefits. And as someone who is a person of color and a woman of color, I'm very proud to have graduated from a university like Penn, and also am proud to have highlighted a very important past, Penn's and America's, that sometimes we are, reluctant to acknowledge. And it's frustrating that we don't talk about slavery. It's frustrating that slavery is difficult to talk about, because the more conversations we have about it amongst ourselves, amongst scholars, the more we'll see the ways that the ripples affect our society today. I was speaking with Greg. Is he still here? Did he go? No. Well, I was talking with Greg about the mass incarceration, the privatized prison industry, and how that's just slavery by another name. If you look at slavery and see the ripples after its ending and after the Civil War, you'll see that projects like these, looking into different institutions, not just schools, are so important for our understanding of the country. Sorry,
So I think we should, I totally lost track of time. I think we'll end there, and thank you again for inviting